we are basically being discipled into thinking that time is nothing but this endless sequence of meaningless moments, that there are no larger stories. The resurrection on Sunday morning. And so there are two stories, and our story is part of that story. And that is such a meaningful and helpful anchor in such an anxious age.
When our post-everything world has turned life upside down, how do you even know which end is up?
If you're committed to a community or a cause greater than yourself, you don't have the luxury of checking out or the freedom to burn out.
It's not enough to just keep surviving. We need to thrive again.
This is Post Everything,
a podcast about remapping culture and rethinking leadership in a liminal age.
Welcome to Post Everything. My name is John Houmes, and I'm here today with my co-host Brad Edwards, and we are interviewing Dr. Sarah Irving-Stonebraker. Now, you might remember last year, March of 2025, I got to interview Dr. Irving-Stonebraker about her book, Priests of History, and the contours of living in what she calls is an ahistoric age. That's an age that's untethered to history. And in her book, she describes 5 different characteristics of an ahistoric age. Let me review those real quick. One is the belief that the past is merely a source of shame and oppression from which we must free ourselves. 2, we don't think of ourselves as part of historical communities. 3, we're increasingly ignorant of history. 4, we don't believe history has a narrative or a purpose. 5, we're unable to reason well and disagree peaceably about the ethical complexities of the past, the coexistence of good and evil in the same historical figures or periods. Now, if you want to go back and listen to that episode, we'll link it in the show notes, but I want to list those characteristics of an ahistoric age very briefly because we're going to push into new territory. We're going to be looking at what artificial intelligence does when it meets an ahistoric age. How do they interact? Does it help us make sense of history, or does it harm our relationship to it? Does it give us a mastery over historical knowledge, or does it cause historical wisdom to elude us? So let's get into the interview now with Dr. Sarah Irving-Stonebraker as we talk about how AI meets the age of ahistoricism. Well, Brad and I are here with Dr. Sarah Irving-Stonebraker. Sarah, welcome to the podcast again.
Thank you very much, John. It is great to be back.
Yeah. Well, let's jump in. Last time you were on, we talked a lot about your book, Priests of History, which if you haven't read it yet, get it. It's an amazing read. The book frames this idea of an ahistoric age, the idea that more recently we've been able to treat the past as almost if it's irrelevant. We've grown ignorant of it. We've reduced it to a ideological weapon to bash our opponents. And since we've last talked, there's been an accelerant hitting the gas pedal on artificial intelligence. And so I want to pick back up on that thread and how AI might even impact this idea of our ahistorical moment. We have lost the ability to reason morally with each other. Instead, we just assert what we feel, what philosophers call emotivism. Let's talk about ahistoricity and artificial intelligence in moral reasoning. So if moral norms need a grounding tradition to be more than an emotive assertion, what happens to ethics in an AI age that has no shared story, only aggregated preferences? Are we automating emotivism?
And please try to respond in less than book length form.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Good luck.
Sorry, it took me a while to get there.
No, I mean, that was a really great framing. And I think one of the most fascinating things about what AI is doing is how it is fundamentally altering our experience of time, right? Because, John, like you just mentioned, the content that's generated by AI, for one thing, we don't know where it came from. There's no story to that content. And the way that we interact constantly with AI is just this endless sequence of meaningless moments. We input the data. So AI is fundamentally, it basically approaches time as if it's meaningless. And what that does to us is that it, as we know, technologies disciple us, but we are basically being discipled into thinking that time is nothing but this endless sequence of meaningless moments, that there are no larger stories. And it's accelerating, therefore, all these ahistorical tendencies that define our cultural moment. And I think, the really interesting thing is with the advent of AI, we're starting, especially in the church, to have some great conversations about what it's doing to our conception of a human being, and how actually
Yeah.
the church can speak into that anthropology question. But actually, what I think we're only just starting to realize, and what there's not a lot of discussion yet about, is what is it doing to our experience of time?
Oh, interesting. Say more, please.
Okay. So, I guess, so a couple minutes ago, John, you were framing all of this in terms of we're now living in what I call this ahistoric age, a cultural moment in which we basically approach the past, especially, as if, like you said, it's largely irrelevant. Or we tend to be, as a consequence, I think, largely ignorant of history. And when we do engage with the past, we basically kind of reduce it to ideology. And, the funny thing is, when I wrote the book and it came out just over a year ago, AI was not even really sort of in popular consciousness in the way that it is now. Like, the rapid
Yeah.
succession of time has just been so incredibly accelerated by AI. But what we see AI doing, I think, is accelerating all those aspects of ahistoricism. I mean,
Hmm.
even when you think about the first one, irrelevance, when you think about the major way, actually, that human beings are interacting with AI, I mean, the Harvard Business Review that does its studies about, what are the major types of questions that people feed into AI and the major ways they're using it. Both, even the updated study that just recently came out, it's still therapy and companionship. So even when you think about that fundamental attempt of human beings to kind of use AI for relationship and companionship, what it's doing there is creating a relationship which is not even part of any larger story.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, I mean, when you have any kind of relationship with somebody, there is a past and a present and hopefully a future to that relationship. You understand that that there is a story to that relationship. But the AI relationship, there is no story. So in all these kinds of ways, we're basically being discipled into this new way. It's not a fundamentally new way of thinking, but I think it actually accelerates one of the tendencies of modernity, which is the past is basically irrelevant. We just do nothing but write our own stories. And importantly, there's no ultimate story. And so we can just invent one.
Wow. Yeah. Like, I mean, we've used the kind of analogy of like the AI as a digital pool of narcissists, right? It's reflecting back toward you what you are projecting into it, either in your desires and what you're looking for and you're wanting and asking it for explicitly, but also because of the way it's trained on all of these other, all this data and all of this other content, written content. You are part of a context that it's then kind of like taking advantage of and assuming so many things that it's then testing on whether or not it's going to increase your engagement or not. But what that does is it means it's only a one-way street. You're not actually relating to it. It's like drawing you in a way, but it as a mirror draws your attention, not as like something a picture of beauty or a scene or something. Like it's not humanizing and it's drawing in. Is that? I mean, I feel like I just went really esoteric with
Yeah.
with that. But is that a little bit of what you're talking about when you say that it's affecting our experience of time?
Yes, in the sense that we're constantly, so that what you're just saying there is that we're constantly kind of feeding into it content. And so time in that sense is kind of meaningless as far as AI is concerned, because
Mm-hmm.
you can always re-enter the data. You can always restore the conversation. And so time, I mean, Christians know, of course, that we're part of a linear story, an ultimate story, in which time can be lost. And that which is in the past is in the past. But we also, of course, we can talk about this later, but, we have an eternal hope because Christ will return. But when we interact with AI, we basically become, and it's a false story, but the story is that, or the false kind of narrative is that we just are the complete sovereigns and masters of our own time.
Mm.
And that there is no larger story.
Well, I mean,
And
even
it's just an impediment to efficiency.
oh yeah. Oh well, I mean, even like I can't remember where I saw this, but I saw somebody pointing out that because the medium of a chatbot resembles, any kind of a text or a messaging app or anything else that we use to interact with actual human beings, and there's this blurring of lines there. We assume that we're actually interacting with something on a linear like continuity of time that like we're building on interactions. But what somebody pointed out that I think is really helpful and fascinating, an example of this is how every time you hit enter on your keyboard or return on your keyboard, it's actually ramping up a fresh set of processing. You're not building on something that came before. It's actually looking at your history, like the past history
Yeah.
of text. It's not actually a relationship. It's stopping and it's done, and then it's restarting the next time you consult it. It's not even like, even if we just like put aside the fact that it's not a person or human, that alone is a weird thing to wrap our minds around. You realize how easily we can be kind of fooled by that medium. Um, man,
Yeah.
I'm curious. I'd like to ask a little bit about the ways in which AI can be a catalyst for the way that we like figure out how to know things, right? I love that you're talking about how like we need to remember the past, and you mentioned why. And my freshman year civics class, Mr. Vincent Terrigian was my teacher. I remember it clearly. In every single class, he would reference this quote he had on the back of the wall from George Santayana: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And I feel like you'd probably agree with that. As a historian, you spend your life looking backward, but I appreciate the way and we are already kind of talking about how understanding the past at least helps you make new mistakes.
Mm.
And how that is a really good thing, but you learn something about human nature and what we do together or by ourselves, and like how we respond to different circumstances. And so if AI ends up being about half as transformative as we think it will be, it's going to be the biggest epistemic shift in society and culture since the printing press gave us mass literacy. And I
Yeah.
think most of us would understand and know that, like, hey, mass literacy is a really good thing. And yet also it meant 300 years of the bloodiest religious wars ever fought on the European continent.
Yeah.
So pros and cons. Could you apply
Yeah.
your
Okay.
this framework in your kind of historical lesson learning lens here, and what is it going to do? What do you suspect it will do? I'm not asking you to be a prophet, but just like an educated guess around, will AI deepen this kind of historicism, or is it going to be something different? And where just in general do you think human knowing is going to go over the next 20 years? Like, what is the path that we're still early on, but still on?
Yeah. Yeah. Clearly, those epistemological questions, so like questions, Brad, that you raised about like, okay, so what is knowledge? What is truth?
Mm,
They apply in very particular ways to history. And, as a historian, as a professor of history, I'm obviously really concerned about, what is happening to our understanding of history. And I don't just mean that as a college professor. I mean that as somebody who actually is really convinced that as Christians, we need to be practicing the stewarding of the past in our daily lives. But anyway, um, actually, what AI is doing to history is even questioning this idea that there is a coherent subject of study, an object of knowledge in the past that we can actually know. That the discipline of history, until the advent of AI, it's just premised on, like, it relies upon this idea that um, we never do it perfectly, but that
yeah.
that the past is knowable as an object of knowledge. And we do this through
Hmm.
various, the collection of sources and the mining of archives and so forth. But that we can reconstruct enough empirically about the past to know it in some way, even though it appears strange to us and other. And we always have to apply, our own interpretive strategies to it. But one thing that's kind of fundamental here in terms of the thinking about and knowing about the past that AI is doing is that it is actually questioning whether or not we can think about the past as an object of knowledge anymore, precisely because the kind of understanding of the past that AI can just fabricate means that we never actually know, because, the images, think about, the whole deep fake phenomenon, apply it to a historical
Sure.
source.
Yeah.
You never actually know whether the source is a real source, whether the photograph or the archival source or the digitized source is a real source. Um,
It's about
and
what you can
so,
trust.
increasingly this issue of, well, what is
Yeah.
truth and what is historical truth? Um, increasingly, there's going to be this question about, can we even know what the past actually was? So I've done a couple of kind of experiments in this sense to kind of illustrate these things. A couple of weeks ago, so I'm a historian of early modern Europe, but a couple of weeks ago I was preparing to give a talk to my son's class at school, and it was actually about Jesus as a historical figure. So I'm there, and I'm research. I want to show them photos of archaeological sites, and I want to show them actual photographs of Greek papyrus manuscripts of New Testament Gospels. And so I find these photographs, and then I'm like, oh, let's see what AI, like, if AI can actually retrieve, like, I'm not even telling it to create an image. Can you retrieve for me a real photograph of this particular archaeological site, or give me any archaeological site, and give me one of the papyrus manuscript, one of the many, right? Thousands of papyrus manuscripts in the New Testament. And it didn't take long to realize that even when I said, no, give me a real one and source it and date, it says that it's doing this, but they're not real images. Now, I can know this because obviously I'm a historian, and other people would probably at this point be able to discern that that they're fakes as well. But it's presenting it as real. And so,
Yeah.
this larger point, like, well, hold on, as far as, the person on the street is concerned, is this an actual object from the past? Did this event really happen? The past as a coherent object of knowledge is actually increasingly thrown into question.
Yeah. That's really
Man.
that's really interesting. It makes me think even there's so many movies that have a historical take on them. It's a historical story, a historical drama. And I even think about the movie Midway, which is about the Battle of Midway in World War II. And there's a previous Midway that came out in like the 60s that my dad loves. And that film is much more about the actual strategy and tactics of the Battle of Midway. The new modern one's much more about the relationships and the action, and it's framed in that. But that affects like how we perceive that historical event. And then I wonder, but you sort of know that you're watching a movie. You plug something into artificial intelligence, and you
There's no
assume that
context.
there's no
Yeah.
context. You assume that you're getting something academic, and you're not at all. Brad and I have talked about The Chosen, and like, I don't want to get too deep into it. People have really strong feelings both ways about it. I see some benefit. People get interested in Jesus. At the same time, they look at it and they assume this is how it happened. This is what he looked, maybe even this is what he looked like. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
can, there is some real challenge there when you take an event, an artifact, and you assume that it's real.
Yeah.
What do you see? Okay, so you've identified a little bit of a problem there. What does that do to a human? What does that do to a society if we start treating things as historical and factual and they might not actually be?
Yeah. I think it does all kinds of things. I mean, even just if we, pick an area. Okay. I think even in terms of some of the ways that we think about the past, again, there are profound consequences for thinking that, or that the information that is being produced by these large language models is actually giving us any picture of the past. And the kind of breakdown. The interesting thing is here as well that a lot of these tendencies are inherent in late modernity. When a lot of what was called postmodern theory came out a few decades ago, there was kind of all kinds of quite useful concepts like the idea of like the breakdown between the way in which screens and so forth broke down the kind of relationship between, what is reality and what is the kind of hyper reality that you interact with. I mean, all of these things I think are just being kind of accelerated by AI, but it has all kinds of consequences for history. Not least, I mean, here's another one in terms of what we know about the past. It's a sort of riff off the Midway film reference, John, that you made, which is that the way that large language models work, of course, is that they are receptive to the data that's being put into them. So now, in terms of the consequences that has for popular understandings of the past, and the narratives that we tell about large stories about the past, stories that have incredible significance for nations and peoples. If there are enough people, if there's enough data, as it were, that's being kind of picked up by the large language models that have a completely false understanding of the past, then that understanding of the past is going to be spat out. So I think probably a good illustration of this is if you get enough people denying the Holocaust, something that in my generation was obviously very easily able to be dismissed, as in people who are Holocaust deniers, it's quite easy to sort of dismiss them on the basis of history. But if large language models pick up enough data that have completely false understandings of the past, then you're going to start getting a situation in which it becomes increasingly plausible, like the plausibility structures of society, for one thing, are going to change. And it's going to become entirely plausible to deny the Holocaust occurred or, insert any other kind of historical event that you might want to deny, or a completely different narrative about history. And so it's going to keep reframing these kind of narratives about the past, just not actually based on any kind of evidence, but just based upon what we spit out. So it's passive and it's imitating the past. It doesn't actually do any genuine historical work for us. But anyway, sorry.
And no, I mean, I think that is a disturbing, very clear example, because, right, if there aren't really any guardrails that would prevent the companies that are providing the AI service and model that to bias factuality over sycophancy, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a built-in in the market incentives of how the rush to gain to capitalize and have the dominant majority, if not monopoly, on subscribers. That incentive already shapes the way that we're interacting with AI as it is. But like the distrust, to go back to the distrust that you mentioned just a minute ago, like if we get to this point, which I think a lot of us are already there, where like you just like literally can't trust anything that you see online, because the amount of AI generated content and slop means like I have no idea if this is hallucinating. I have no idea if this is even real. And you're able to flood with the entire internet with so much content. Like it has the effect of essentially making the entire internet a 4chan. Like,
Yeah.
it's gonna. I feel like what I worry about is it will create a populace that is so that has had skepticism of any truth claim or expertise or institutions, that skepticism and cynicism valorized for long enough that like we don't even like we're actually unable to, never mind moral reasoning, we're unable to even socialize or have any kind of a common purpose together. I don't know. I go to a dark place real fast when we get into epistemology. So
no. And I think actually to kind of bring it back to the ahistoricism thing, that I think is really a good kind of way of encapsulating what's happening. When people are increasingly discipled into thinking that there are no larger stories, or just invent, like you can constantly invent and reinvent your own story, even if it's a kind of quasi-spiritual story, then the whole enterprise of story, like there's no larger stories, and you end up with some kind of sense that you don't even know where you're going. Society doesn't know where it's going. And when there is no larger story, you have no meaning and no purpose. And I think as well, when you look at the amount of discussion today about what kind of pictures of the future, as in, for me, I'm interested in this because like, what does the end of time look like? What does history look like? Now, if you look at the way that popular culture and sort of tech bro phenomenon, transhumanism, Elon Musk, whatever the particular approaches of people are about a tech influenced and AI shaped future, it's really interesting the way that actually the kind of, even the more kind of optimistic, quasi, it'll present itself as a kind of utopian story of like nothing but overcoming, we'll overcome. Transhumanism is basically a kind of salvation narrative, which is going to overcome even the limitations of our own body, this movement that's even going to try to overcome death. But how close that is actually to a profoundly pessimistic and dystopian view of the future. And the reason for that is that they're not actually real stories, like they're counterfeit stories, because they don't have, we know as Christians, they don't have an end, because they don't have the real story, which is about God and the return of Christ. So yeah, sorry, Brad, to get back to that kind of question, there is this kind of sense that the endless proliferations of stories and the opportunity just to invent your stories makes all stories meaningless. And so you lose any kind of sense of hope and purpose and meaning.
Well, that explains a lot.
I think we've talked a little bit on the podcast too, about the rise of what many are calling metamodernism, where they're rejecting this idea that there can't be a story. We've got to find some grand narrative to live in, even if it's got flaws. And I think a lot of people are actually open to spirituality because of that. It's not perfect. I'm okay with that, but I got to have hope somewhere. So that's an interesting aspect. But I want to ask you about some of your research on useful knowledge. You've studied aspects of the Scottish Enlightenment, and there's a piece of your research that I can't stop thinking about in connection to AI. You wrote a paper and connected some 18th century thinkers, Adam Ferguson, Adam Smith, and others, to a term called useful knowledge that was used as a way to rank entire civilizations on a ladder from like civilized towards even savage. And again, you're an expert on this, so if I'm misstating this or I'm misapplying it, feel free to correct me. But in your paper, you research how Scottish trained naturalists sailed around the world and literally ranked the peoples they met, like Tongans or Maori or Aboriginal Australians, Native Americans, by whether they could produce useful knowledge. And so I'm curious if you can define useful knowledge and then explain how it became a criterion by which to judge whole societies. And maybe if there's any connection with that concept of useful knowledge as we talk about artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Okay. Well, John, that's a massive question.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. So if I got it wrong, feel free to correct me.
No, not at all. It's just a kind of massive question and an exciting question. Okay. I think the thing that your listeners will find really interesting about the history of this idea of useful knowledge is that, today in the 21st century, and for a long time in modernity, we've kind of taken for granted this idea that, the study of the natural world, and we'll now call that science, produces knowledge that is useful in the sense that it improves human life in some way. And so one of the things I've been really interested in my work in doing as a historian of ideas, historian of science and Christianity, is kind of tracing the origins of like, where did we get this idea that knowledge ought to be useful in some way? And one of the really interesting things about this is that the reason why, so, in the ancient world, there's like the techne knowledge, practical knowledge that helps us do things, but it's kind of, in the hierarchy of knowledge, it's not esteemed. It's the knowledge of people who have to dig ditches and work out how to work things. But one of the things that begins to happen, and it only happens we now sort of use the word the scientific revolution, is this idea that the study of the natural world can be tied to this idea that it will produce knowledge that will be helpful, useful, if you like, to humankind in some way or another. And it's actually, at its origins, this is the other interesting thing, it's actually a deeply theological conviction. It's basically a whole lot of Protestants in Europe in the 16th century, so before the guys, John, that you were just talking about, is where it sort of originates, who start kind of arguing that because of the severity of the fall, the effects of the fall on humanity, not just our kind of moral capacity, but actually on humanity's cognition, their argument is that actually in the fall, humanity lost what was originally an encyclopedic knowledge of the entire natural world. And that one of the kind of tasks of of a of a nation, particularly in Britain, but I think it's also true actually probably in sort of some of the early American colonies, that sees itself as kind of taking up the Protestant mantle,
Yeah.
is to regain this kind of perfect knowledge and use knowledge that will be useful, to quote Francis Bacon, to sort of for the improvement of mankind's estate. Now, so anyway, deeply kind of theological idea, because they believe that the improvement, it's all tied to their eschatology, incidentally, as well. They sort of believe they're participating in the coming of Christ's kingdom and all the rest of it. But over the course of the next few hundred years, one of the things that happens is that with this kind of long process that's often called, the secularization, one of the things that happens is this idea of useful knowledge gets detached from the idea of its ultimate purpose, to glorify God, to participate in the coming of his kingdom. And so by the 20th century, I'm summarizing a lot of complex history here, and I don't want to sort of be over.
No, this is great.
But by the 20th century, you basically get this idea, and a lot of, not just theologians, but like philosophers and social theorists kind of comment on this, including like Max Weber, one of the founders of sociology. But one of the things they kind of note is, there is a kind of complete disentanglement or bifurcation of the idea that we just produce knowledge that's useful, and the idea of like, well, what is the end or the purpose of that usefulness? And so you get people like Weber who sort of comment that in the modern age, you just have this kind of rationality or utility that's kind of unbound from any kind of ultimate good or purpose. Okay, so long story about, what was once a, beautiful theological idea, and it gets unbound and has consequences, John, like you alluded to there, for the way that other types of knowing from other civilizations and cultures were understood. But then you kind of get to the kind of rapid acceleration of the digital revolution. And even before that, sort of the information, revolution with the advent of computing in the 20th century. And you really start to get this question that's being asked more and more, even more so in a global world, which is there any kind of ultimate purpose to knowledge and to useful knowing? And I think that is one of the enormous questions related to those questions about what it is to be human, that AI is actually posing for us.
Wow. Yeah, I'm curious if you could fill that out in one direction, especially because I mean, just the phrase "useful knowledge," kind of to prioritize that implies that there's a demotion of non-useful knowledge. And
Yeah.
as Americans, we are nothing if not pragmatic, and so useful knowledge sounds great, right?
Yeah.
Whatever helps us achieve and do more is great. I think that's one of the reasons why AI, the hype cycle for AI is so intense, because it's really tapping into this, depending on the degree, it could be an inherent and good value of filling the earth and subdue it, being able to be productive and useful as a human being, I think is a good thing. But it sometimes it really smacks of idolatry, right? And that makes me really uncomfortable, especially when I think about how, we've talked on the post everything about how, post-pandemic, after regathering as a church, we kind of had to teach people how to people again, because we were disembodied as a community. So like if we become I think the potential to be reliant on AI is far greater than we ever were on social media. Especially if there is as many vocational consequences and implications for this.
That's true.
If that's the case, like, what is it that we lose? What is at risk of just kind of being demoted into oblivion in our values, because our values are being shaped by AI, that like we got to be real careful to hold on to and not allow to be just, like I said, demoted into oblivion by our use of this. Like, and I know that's a huge question. I mean, we're being very mean to you right now. With
no,
like, these are not easy questions.
Kind of thinking. It's great to kind of think together about these things. I think, one of the things, Brad, that you were touching upon there is the way that actually what AI does is it effectively means that you just think about knowledge in terms of productivity and efficiency,
Yes.
right? But there's no telos, like there's no end to that.
Yes.
And so then, and so there's actually this, ironically, this kind of idea of mastery. We know the proper framework for mastery of the creation, which is, to steward and have dominion over the creation. From Genesis, which is that we are actually vicegerents. We're not the ultimate masters. We govern and we steward the creation because we are doing it in the image of God and in his manner. Anyway, so once that gets unbounded from that theological framework and ultimate purpose and telos, you get left with nothing but efficiency and productivity as an end in itself, which is why so many people are kind of searching around for meaning. But in terms of the other question you raised, which is, okay, what does this do to kind of other forms of knowing, particularly for the lives of Christians and the spiritual lives of people and this kind of spiritual yearning that people have even before and when they're not Christians. I think it clearly has this effect of making us think that the only way of knowing and being is one of mastery over things. Which is the complete opposite of being, well, it is at tension with the idea, because it's not a complete opposite, because there is actually a sense, of course, of mastery, but it is in profound tension with the idea that, oh no, we are actually, as creations in the image of God, we are dependent beings. And our way of knowing, I mean, think about, all the understandings of, even, philologically and linguistic, like what are this term, like the terms for knowledge and wisdom biblically. There are ways of knowing that are actually about trusting in the Lord and the fact that there are actually limits to knowledge. There are limits to mastery. Think about, the way of trusting in the Lord with all your heart and leaning not on your own understanding. And so what it's doing is making us think that there are no limits, that we are the ultimate masters, and it's a completely false and dangerous kind of narrative, of course. But what that does is also it kind of and I think dangerously, if we're not aware of it, it's a kind of narrative that can seep into the church too, and can kind of it can kind of tempt Christians into this way of thinking. But it tempts us into thinking that we're not living into this larger story in which we are dependent upon God, in which we are not the complete masters, in which we are not the ultimate sovereigns at all.
Wow.
You said something that hit me so hard that it physically hurt me. I think it's not your fault though.
It's a long range from Australia.
No, that's impressive. I hurt myself all the time, but it's Anyway, no, when you're using the language of mastery over knowledge and information, it hit me that isn't this literally the original sin of wanting to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to be a master of that, a master of knowing without having to be a student of knowing.
Yeah.
Without having to be a disciple of and reliant on God and leaning on his understanding instead of our own. We wanted that for ourselves. I don't want to look into scripture I don't want to eisegete into scripture, a modern technology that was nowhere near the scope of intent there. But that doesn't feel like a stretch. But is that wrong? Am I crazy for making that connection?
No. Yeah. I think that's exactly true. These ideas of mastery. And of course, I think biblically, this is how we are instructed to think about the nature of human sin. It is a misdirected good. So the idea of mastery is a good when it's understood as a proper mastery within the commission of the Lord, both Old Testament, New Testament senses of what that commission is and what that stewardship looks like. But it's entirely biblical to realize that, of course, what we're actually going to do as human beings is to take some part of that and distort it in some way and think that ultimate mastery is in fact what we're doing. And think too, everything we've been talking about the the nature of time makes us think that we are masters of our own time. I mean, think about the way in which an entire, field of self-help books are devoted to like how to manage time and just treat it as a resource, as if we're masters of time, and how much there are so many useful discussions, including, on this very podcast, about how to live in such a way that our spiritual practices actually structure our time in terms of the larger story, which I think is actually going to be key. We could even talk about that actually. What are some of the key things that Christians can be doing to kind of reform ourselves in the age of AI?
That's great. Let's go there, because in your work you've spotlighted some helpful comparisons between what we could call anti-formation or deformation, and then you just use the word reformation. You've talked a little bit about like kitsch versus beauty. So even
Yeah.
as we talk about AI, like AI can generate infinite images and music on demand, and like they're technically fascinating, like they're maybe technically beautiful, but they feel hollow.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
lacks a transcendence or a sacred beauty.
Yes. I'd love to talk. Can we talk about that?
Let's do it. Go
Oh,
for it.
I mean, maybe. Okay.
Please.
That is so, that's so interesting when we think about the nature of beauty, and because this is really this, larger question about, okay, what is the nature of creativity? And what does it mean? Partly this question gets us into like, what does it mean to be human? But also the fact that AI, right, is nothing but an imitation game. It just imitates, right? It uses language as its fodder. I was thinking about how to kind of describe this the other day, and I sort of think the word, the term cannon fodder, which we use, actually what AI does, I think, is actually turn language into machine fodder. It just eats it up. Whereas we know as human beings, language is a divine gift, right? We have a God who spoke the creation into being. The word became flesh, but AI imitates and just profanes language by using it as nothing but a resource. So anyway. But where it gets us, I think, to this great point that, John, you just raised about the nature of creativity is that, and this actually kind of relates to history too, which is why I'm really interested in it, is that so many times when you do historical work, as is the case when anyone does creative or artistic work, the nature of originality is such that you're kind of bringing together both established, patterns. Think about, the beautiful patterns in Bach's music, or the sort of received patterns and stories that are kind of passed down through the centuries. But there's a kind of breaking into that pattern of something which is idiosyncratic and different enough to give it some kind of beauty and creativity and originality. And of course, a large language model, by its definition, is never going to break into, because its algorithms are such that it's based upon predictability, like linguistic predictability. So it flattens, this is particularly significant when it comes to history as well, it flattens and renders things generic. And so anything that it creates is never going to have a spark of anything which is particularly idiosyncratic or related to an individual experience. Whereas by contrast, I mean, if you think, so like my sort of classic contrast or kind of example here is Dvorak, one of my favorite composers. Also, of course, like, Czech immigrant, moved to America. But a lot of us have heard the New World Symphony and some of his American quartets. But one of the reasons why they're so beautiful is that he's bringing something of his own very individual experience as a Czech immigrant to America. And it's the breaking in of those sort of, folk melodies from historic Czech folk songs that are so idiosyncratic to him that makes this music beautiful. But yeah, again, large language models are never going to have this, because they don't allow for the particularity of individual experience. And likewise, so here's the kind of historical, this is why I think it's important when it comes to history as well. Like when we think about passing down historical stories as well, or even doing the kind of interpretive, creative work of coming up with frameworks to understand the past, it's often actually this sort of bringing together of quite unlikely ideas or metaphors that actually produce something interesting. So, in Priests of History, the book that that I wrote that we've talked about, it's really, I think, a kind of good illustration of this, because where the phrase and the kind of idea of thinking about our responsibility towards the past as Christians as one of like stewardship, and actually using the word priesthood in very kind of biblical, both Old and New Testament sense of like, priests tending
Yeah.
and keeping, and the priesthood of all believers, is it's actually this idiosyncratic connection I made between business of history and the fact that decades earlier, before I was even a Christian, and I was reading this 17th century natural philosopher at the time, who's a man of deep faith, Robert Boyle. He wasn't even writing about history at all. He uses the phrase priests of nature in relation to what a natural philosopher should be. And so it was the bringing together, and I'm remembering what I read like decades earlier in a completely different context. He's not interested in history, but I'm bringing together basically a kind of a metaphor and a concept of an idea that Boyle had used, and then bring it into a different field of endeavor intellectually, I guess, that actually produces some kind of fruit there. But you see how that's because it gives us this kind of idea, this framework of priests of history. But see how that's a really idiosyncratic thing. And it's not, so large language models are not designed to be able to come up with the idiosyncratic.
Yeah, I mean, they bulldoze the particularity to just like force everything into a mean or an average. And so, but that means there is, like, this is what I struggle with when we think about creativity. Like, creativity, anytime someone says "Hey, that was really creative," or that was, this is a beautiful creative work, they're not saying that was a good representation of what the average of what human beings are able to produce. Like, they're literally meaning this is exceptional, this is different, this is innovative, and moved something forward rather than recycling. And I think that there's something really there about connected to time, because it really, like, I don't think most Westerners really fully appreciate just how much Christianity has shaped, like, even what little sense of history we do have.
Yeah.
Because prior to Christianity, there wasn't a trajectory or a direction to history. It was cyclical, and it was just so there's no point in pushing forward. And there's something like weirdly pagan, like, about the design and DNA of AI, like large language models specifically. Let me be specific and clear there. That has an almost like kind of a pagan, an unavoidably pagan approach to both time and creativity. That's recycling or cycles. It's not actually moving anything forward. It's just wheel spinning.
Yeah. Yeah, yes, exactly. Because there's no sense that they have any given story in which there's an end that they're part of. I mean, I think, obviously as Christians.
It's back to story, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's because we know the end, as it were. It's because we have eschatology. And yet, we're living in this moment in which we eagerly anticipate the coming again of Christ and the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. That enables us to realize that our lives have any kind of meaning and that we can have any kind of hope. But there's a givenness to that story. It's not a story that we create for ourselves.
Yeah. Well, you've used that term, givenness, as to juxtapose the self-creation, which in a sense, self-creation can be such a burden to constantly recreate yourself. But you found a lot of positivity in terms of the church's role in all this. You already talked about it. We talk a lot on this show about counterformation. Brad has come up with the term spiritual greenhouse. The church should be a spiritual greenhouse. And I've loved that term. I've stolen it and used it in our family ministries here at Spanish River Church. But what he means by that is it forms us, it anchors us in a dehumanizing world. You use the word reformation through embodied practices that shape us against the grain of deformative technologies and algorithms. I'm just curious, like, as you think about what practices are important in the current moment, or maybe even how the obvious practices help reform us, could you speak to the church's role in reformation and Christians' habits and practices that can build this counter reformation against what technology might be doing to us?
Yeah, such a great question. And I think, there's a lot of really great conversation in the church today and books being published about spiritual practices and disciplines, which is so helpful. I think especially in the age of AI, what we really need to be doing is actually something that the church has been doing ever since its very origins, which is that Christians have been using these practices in such a way that whenever actually they're engaged in them, they are doing so as consciously living into and enacting the larger story, the
Yes.
larger salvation narrative. I mean, one of the really interesting things, even as a historian, when you look back at the centuries before us, especially like Christians in the church, is how keenly aware they always were, how conscious they were of the fact that they lived as part of this larger story. And so the way that they structured their time in daily life was actually something of a subversive resistance against the way in which the secular world, or the kingdom they were part of, was trying to kind of structure and form their time, because think about the way in which when Christians observed daily rhythms of prayer throughout the day, seasons in the church of celebrating the feast of Christ, seasons of penitence and thanksgiving, and of course also even regardless of your theology, even just to remember and to reenact the Lord's Supper. What you're doing there is not just engaging in a spiritual practice, you're actually participating in a larger story. And I actually think that today, when we think about the fact that in the church, we're surrounded by a lot of young people, some of them our biological children perhaps, but maybe a lot just kind of spiritual children and brothers and sisters. One of the things that can be most helpful is to be thinking about, if your spiritual practices are great, then that's awesome. Otherwise, keep thinking about building those spiritual practices based upon the ones that have been used historically and the way in which they actually enable you to very consciously participate in the larger story. So in other words, like, we're doing this because even the practice of coming to God in repentance, actually, we're doing this because we're actually part of this larger, not only have, like in church history, all the Christians before us, practice these particular prayers of repentance, for example. But we're also part of the larger salvation narrative in which, like, Israel comes to God in repentance. And, we are, so that very act of repentance is part of a larger story, as is all the other spiritual practices that we're engaged in. So think about making sure that in our very daily lives, we're orienting our time around being part of this larger story.
And
Yeah,
we tell whenever we do our church does our membership class, we start near the beginning to talk about how the gospel is in this context of redemptive history, which is a
yeah,
much bigger deal than, like, that starts long before Matthew chapter 1, right? And when we kind of lay out, hey, this is what creation, fall, redemption, and consummation are, and
yeah,
here's what that means for from the perspective of God, man, and creation. And by the end of that, I say, like, they're like, whoa, this is huge. This is great. Like, why don't, one time I had somebody
yeah,
ask, like, why haven't you ever preached on this? This is amazing. I'm like, because it's literally our liturgy every single week.
yeah,
Our call to worship is the call
yeah,
of our creator in creation. Confession and assurance is bridging from fall into redemption, which is then the sermon and the and communion every week. And consummation is the benediction. And when I connect those dots, the slack-jawed,
yeah,
wide open eyes like reaction is so amazing, and I love it. But
yeah,
like, we're so not used to thinking this way,
yeah,
because we think that, like, if our kids, if the sermon isn't geared toward our kids and like illustrations they understand, then they're not picking anything up. It's like, no, 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 no. Like that might be a good idea. I'm not saying it's not a good idea, but there are always, this is a kind of knowing that is, yes, includes information. The gospel's good news, but the way we are embodying that information on every Sunday morning is actually an expression of that same good news.
yeah,
And that is experienced, it's tacit, it's not explicit, but it's still shaping and forming you, even if you're not consciously processing and doing something with it. It is changing you because you're participating in it. Sorry, I'm gonna stop
Of
preaching. I just
course.
love what
Yeah.
you're saying because I'm like, yes, finally somebody's saying this. This is
Yeah.
because we tell our people this all the time, and it's so important.
Yeah. And what a fascinating illustration of just the degree of ahistoricism in our cultural moment
Yeah.
that your congregation members were like, oh wow, yeah, there's that largest, like, that's why we do this. Like, that is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one kind of example that we happen to use in our family is we do like a vigil on Easter Sunday morning where we read, so like Reformed Anglican read through the Easter Vigil. And when we're doing this, so it's like before dawn, and we're sitting around the table with our own family, but also inviting members of the church as well. Whoever wants to come, get up that early. But one of the incredibly beautiful things about this is that it's a good illustration of how you can consciously invite people there into this larger story and make them understand that, like, that's actually what's happening here. And so
Wow.
there's two stories here that are entwined. First of all, there's the church history story. It's like, oh, do you know that, like, actually a kind of vigil on Easter Sunday is actually something which for centuries Christians have practiced. So we're actually doing this because our forebears, not even by, like, I don't actually probably have a lot of biological forebears who are Christian, but like adopted into this Christian family who are now like my forebears spiritually, Abraham's children in the faith, have done this for centuries. So there's that church history. And then there's this even larger sacred history of the vigil and the awaiting of the resurrection on Sunday morning. And so, like, there are two stories, and our story is part of that story. And that is
Wow.
such a meaningful and helpful anchor in such an anxious age.
Yeah. One of the things I appreciate about your work is your posture overlaps a lot with what Brad and I try and do. Is we try not to be afraid to look at how dark things could be.
Yeah.
For you, for instance, looking at ahistoricism and how deformative that is. But it's not because we want to end up in a dark place. It's because we want to figure out how to find the hope of Christ, even amidst the darkness, which is kind
Yeah.
of what you were just talking about, finding your own story in a grander story in this hour you spend together on Easter morning.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, even as we think about some of the places we've looked, some of the darkness we've seen, where else do you find hope? Where else do you find meaning? You're not a despairing person. How do you find hope? Where do you find hope as a historian in this particular moment, considering everything that we've covered and as you look to the future?
Yeah. Um, okay, gosh. I think one of the things that instinctively comes to mind there is to think about the real ways in which um, the gospel is active and living and transforming lives in small ways and in small communities around me. I think particularly when I see what's going on at the school that my kids go to, in which they're like running all kinds of practices at this school in which they're telling this kind of larger salvation story, both to kids who are at the school happen to be from Christian families and who aren't from Christian families. And there's a kind of, an introduction to Christianity course that's being run at a cafe on a morning of the week for interested parents. And in these tiny ways, I'm seeing God working and transforming lives. And he's doing it in this beautiful way in which God always works, which is to use the things that are not particularly glamorous or glorious, but the ordinary, the everyday, the individual kind of embodied relationships, and seeing the way in which, he is at work. And that actually gives me hope. Yeah.
Wow.
That's wonderful. That reminds me a little bit. You mentioned that you had listened to our last episode with Dr. Greg Perry about the drama of discipleship, and he had captured that very same thing that you said. He had just called it the little restorations,
Oh, beautiful.
the
Yeah.
outbreaks of the resurrection in
Yeah.
people's lives, the little spots that God is moving. We so often, I think, have been trained to see things as we sort of look for like big revival and amen.
Yeah.
Yes, we want to see massive movements of the Lord. But if that's all we're waiting for, we will miss the little ways that he is working when people who don't know Jesus are meeting in a cafe just to learn more about Jesus as they drop their kids off at school. And
Yeah.
so I love that.
Yeah.
As we close, I'm curious, what are you working on? Please tell us you're writing another book. We would love to hear that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I am. I'm actually thinking about and kind of embarking on this project of a book, which is really about, I've sort of called it an invitation to the Christian story. And I basically want to write a book which is an introduction to Christianity, so which deals with the larger Christian story and introduces the doctrinal points, but does it in such a way that's part of a story, and basically asks, what a Christian belief, what is the basis of Christian belief? Why has this mattered in the past? What's the fruit that it's borne? Why does it matter today? It's a vision for the good life. And how do we actually live this out? Like, how do we put it into practice? Because I think that this kind of sense I have that what we really need to ground us today is this invitation to live as part of a larger story that brings together both doctrine and practice, and a sense of the real historical fruit that the good news of Jesus has borne, is something that excites me. So,
Wow. Yes, please. That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have at least two copies already pre-sold.
Oh, there you go. There you
Yeah,
go. I just thought of, kind of one more thing, which I thought I'd mention. Our discussion before about like, okay, how does the church, this sort of greenhouse, how do we kind of reform ourselves? And I think, one of the things we're talking about, obviously, is like living out these larger stories in which Christians are a part of. But the other thing I think I would really emphasize is this idea that each one of us really think of yourself as having this kind of priestly responsibility to steward the past and to steward those larger stories. And in many ways, we're a kind of conduit of these stories that we have to kind of pass down, if not to biological children, but actually to brothers and sisters, to spiritual children. Because if we offload that cognitive responsibility of passing down stories to AI, we've talked about a lot about the kind of what's going to happen there. We're going to grow up with generations of Christians who like don't even know what the larger story is, or don't even know that the liturgy of worship on a Sunday morning is actually bringing them into the larger story, or have never heard of the creed, But the other part of this is that actually, I think biblically we are called to steward the past in our daily lives. I think it's actually part of the creation mandate to steward well the gifts that God's given us. Time is actually a gift. It's not something that we own, and the stories in which we live and that can pass down meaning. I mean, we know both from the Old Testament, Israel's stories that are remembered again in the Psalms, and the way that Paul writes, these things were written down for your instruction. We're still instructed to pass these down, and so if I think people can think of themselves as conduits of these stories, both biblical stories, but also even the kind of historical stories of their family, their community, their church, and larger stories as well. Transmitting those stories, I think, is what is going to be essential to stewarding the past in a very anxious and ahistorical age.
I mean, just to even buttress that even further, the repetition of God's command to his people to remember,
Yeah.
right? And because what he's calling you to remember is not, the systematic theology of predestination. He's saying, remember when you were the smallest and weakest of nations in slavery in Egypt, I delivered you. That is a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Genesis is an origin story of the people of God, right? And when it right when the New Testament like points us to our baptism, it's a similar like you are not your own, but because you were rescued apart from anything that you could do to save yourself, right? That inherent graciousness, the only way grace becomes meaningful is through story. And that's the medium of the gospel that's given to us. It's not information, it is a story. And I think that like, I wish if this is not a part of your next book, please write a third book or however many books you've written about how can pastors help people see their own ahistoricity and have a more narratival awareness of what they're actually doing? Because like I was saying before, like, it's not that, I mean, yes, things are happening to us in ways that do not require our conscious processing of the information happening to us, right? However, if this is actually this massive opportunity to actually participate and to take ownership and responsibility, to steward, like you're saying, as priests, like, but there's this huge gap that's just like, how do you explain to a fish that they're wet? Right. That's I think that's a huge challenge. So I whatever that looks like, we need your help. I think is what I'm trying to say, because this is so good and helpful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, history, the story. The story is a divine gift, and so we need to steward it well.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, we've been talking with Dr. Sarah Irving-Stonebraker about ahistoricity, artificial intelligence, and everything in between. Sarah, thanks so much for coming on the podcast again. We learned a lot, and we were really grateful to have this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, John and Brad. It's been great to be here again.
Likewise. Thanks for coming. This is great. Well, John, that was galaxy braining as usual. Now, just historically as well. Now, what is your what are you thinking about? What's stuck in your head, and what can't you stop thinking about?
Well, first of all, it's fun that she actually humors us. Like, we throw out all this stuff, and she's like, "Yeah, that's a great idea. That's a great question." So, I'm really grateful that she thinks we're actually saying something interesting. Because she was fascinating to talk to again. I really appreciated just the discussion about time this morning or yesterday. My oldest daughter was laying on the couch with nothing to do. Her summer has hit a complete standstill, and she's like, "I'm bored." And I was like, you know what? This is so good for you that you're bored. That you have nothing to do, that you're out of screen time. There's nothing on TV. You're just sitting here looking at the ceiling. This was like half my childhood. But it does kind of go to this theme about inhabiting time. So a quote that she said something like, "Time is becoming a compilation of meaningless moments." I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
So we think about passing the time. We think about getting into the next season of time. We think about preparing in time for whatever is coming next. But it just makes me wonder, like, what is AI doing to us in terms of how we view time? History is irrelevant. AI is accelerating that. Is time becoming irrelevant? I don't know. I think she's trying to figure that out as well. Like, how do we think about time? But go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, I mean, the number of times you can just pull out your phone and you pull something up, you're wanting to look up something, but you get distracted, you blink, and then it's 2 hours later. Like the lost time. At our age and stage, and your illustration proved just how much we are middle-aged dads as well as pastors. But like that reality that even technology aside, the days are long, but the years are short, right? And just what an acceleration of that dynamic smartphones do to us, and social media, yes, but like everything from, like, if you change the colors to gray, white, black and white grayscale on your phone, it will reduce your losing time like that significantly. But and I say that because that's like an illustration, an example of just how much these things are designed to extract our time and attention from an embodied world and a story bigger than ourselves. So yeah, I mean, AI just has so much more power to do the same thing that we're already struggling with. So I think that's really important. And I love the way that she connected that with history and our ahistorical worldview already.
Yeah, I'm smirking because I remember when Patrick Miller taught us about the grayscale on their phone at the Gospel
Yeah.
Coalition conference.
You're right. Yep.
Yeah,
That's
a
right.
funny memory. We were
Mhm.
banging on our phones like a bunch of chimps.
Shout
But
out to Patrick. Yeah.
yeah, hey Patrick. Okay, but then she said something that was really interesting. Time is a gift. We don't own it. And that's an interesting way to think about it. You know, James K. A. Smith wrote this book, How to Inhabit Time. Um, and I haven't read it yet, but my understanding of the book is it looks to the past and says, what can we learn from the past? What do we owe to the past? How do we remain faithful in this current moment? And then what do we look for in the kingdom of God in the future? So it is interesting to think about time and us being stewards of the moments that we have rather than just saying, how do we, how much time do we waste? That's not quite where she was going with all that, but I think that however we relate to time, AI is not going to help um, reform us in terms of our relationship to time.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about how multiple times on here about how Tristan Harris makes this great point that a truly new novel technology will commodify a resource that we didn't previously know was a resource. It surfaces these things and then it commodifies it. So, social media has surfaced and created a resource out of attention and then commodified it and sells it and extracts it, right? If AI, as we've talked about on here before, is going to do the same thing to agency, um, we have got to start having a lens for stewardship that includes very non-traditional resources that we're not used to thinking about, right? Like our attention or our time. Like we're not used to having to, we're used to stewarding our calendars in sense of priority, but not not time in the sense of like what we give our time to or our energy to, right? That's a different kind of one layer deeper than our calendars that we're not used to having to think about. And honestly, this is like, I don't know how to do this. Like, if I'm honest, like the solution sounds simple as I describe it, but like how to actually do it against the grain of these things that are that they don't get tired. They don't have to sleep. They don't need community like we do. None of these things. And so this is not a small, this is a huge challenge.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is realizing that it is a fight and you have to give yourself the freedom to have a reset. Like, I have limitations on my phone for social media. And sometimes I go over those limitations because of something else going on. And then I have to reset them. And then I find that I'm now used to the greater quantity I'm allowed. And then even just today, I went back, I was like, nope, I'm going to reset these back. I need to limit myself as much as possible. I think it's the freedom to realize that we're always in a battle. We're always in a fight against these things. So we're not going to do it perfectly, but better to be in the battle than to give yourselves over to being defeated.
That's good. Yeah.
So,
resistance is going to have some wins and losses.
Yep. Yeah.
Yep.
And the losses, rather than defeats, they become intelligence for how to do it better next time.
Yeah.
So
you learn. Almost.
You learn. Yeah. And maybe even that. So she talked about transforming lives in small ways. And maybe even, hey, here's a small win. I had a reset on my social media today. It's a little restoration. It's a little, the Spirit's reminding me, like, what is your role here? Are you doom scrolling, bro? Or, do you need to be present and faithful in other ways? And so I think what she said about, I love that she said, let's look for God working in small ways.
Yeah.
Because we're so tempted to only think instantaneous and only to think go big or go home. And God works that way. But the truth is sanctification's a process, and death and resurrection is a process. And there are times when the Spirit accelerates things in our lives tremendously. And we have these breakthrough moments where we'll never be the same again. But most of life is these
small movements forward in our daily lives where we're learning to love Jesus, we're learning to love those around us, we're learning to say no to sin. And gosh, I wish it went quicker, but it doesn't. It's slow and it's often painful. So I love that she pointed to the small ways that we see lives being transformed.
Yeah, it's a long obedience in the same direction, not an instantaneous obedience very quickly along a path, right?
You should write a book about that.
No, I'm pretty sure that's Dallas Willard, and he already did it better anyway,
Yeah.
so I'm good. But thanks.
Yeah. So, okay, then this is in terms of the relationship with time. Part of me is like, what does the average human look like in 10 years, having related to AI over the last 10 years in relationship to time? But I also think in relationship to the past. So as we're using artificial intelligence over the next year to find out what happened in the past, what does that do to our humanity and our epistemology, our understanding of knowledge? What does the average human look like in 10 years compared to now? I mean, we know like pre-2006, not everyone was walking around with their face down in their phone, right? And now the average human, at every stoplight is picking up their phone and just checking it. So what does it do to us as human beings in our relationship to history, our understanding of knowledge and how we relate to it, to be looking at or to be using AI over the next 10 years? I'm just curious. That's all. That's not a point. I'm just got a question.
Yeah. I mean, I think her point about what this is doing toward our finally kind of being forced to recover by necessity a more humane anthropology, and I would even argue maybe a theological anthropology, since we're image bearers of a creator. And I was, speaking of Tristan Harris, I was listening to a recent episode of their Your Undivided Attention, and he and his co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology were just raving about the Pope's encyclical on AI. And they noticed the same thing. I mean, it's pretty explicit in the encyclical if you've even kind of given a cursory read, but they were just raving about how the Pope used this as an opportunity to talk about to ask the question and pose at least some initial answers of like, what is a human being? And they were like, yes, this is what we need. And I'm listening to them. I'm just like, where have you been, guys? Like, you're supposed to be like way ahead of this. Like, we were on this like 5 seasons ago and post everything. No, but seriously, this is something that our tradition, especially like the Reformed tradition, is really wrestling with and has been for at least a couple of years now, and trying to think through these things. But that's exactly the right question. And it just hit me over the head like, oh my God, like I kind of knew we had good answers to this, but there actually might be wanted now. Like the 2 guys in Silicon Valley are raving about the Pope's encyclical. Like, can we just like pause and mark that happened at all?
Right.
Right. Like, so, and I think we have, honestly, I think our tradition, like, I'm nothing against Catholics or the Pope. Yes, it was an introductory encyclical on this. I'm sure he's intending to do much more, but like, we've got some incredible resources for this to bring to bear. And that's huge. But your question, we've got to ask that question if we're going to be prepared to pastor people through that season. So I if anybody says that they have a really good answer to that question as of right now, I'm going to be very skeptical, because I just don't know how you could. It's pretty early in the process still, but we need to keep asking it.
Yeah. And if you do, email us at posteverythingpod@gmail.com.
Because we would love to have you on as a guest.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. As long as you're not crazy. So, Brad, what did you take out of the episode with Sarah?
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm struck by just a lot of the stuff that she was saying at the end of her narrative. We're recording this on a Thursday, and I just got back yesterday from a 3-night staff retreat with our staff at church. And we're talking about, annual plans for this next year. It's a lot of very useful information. But also we were taking some time, because this is going to be this August September is our church's 10th anniversary since launching, and we're hoping to ordain our first class of elders this fall in at the end of October. And so, as the 10th anniversary, we're all kind of reflecting, like, wow, we're still alive. Like, we're still here as a church. It exists. That alone is a miracle. Like, look at how God has been faithful. So we were doing a lot of celebrating too. We weren't just looking ahead; we were looking into the past, and I didn't even realize what we were doing really until talking to Dr. Irving-Stonebraker, right? The command in Scripture to remember God's faithfulness is given both to Israel when she is like just in the promised land and everything is going great, and also when she's a micro remnant. The command is the same. I just looked it up on Bible Gateway, the ESV. So like, this isn't Greek, so it could be a little bit inaccurate, just to anticipate some potential objections here. But the word remember, at least in the ESV, comes up 234 times. Like, it's either God remembered, God saying, I will remember, or God's people saying they remembered God's faithfulness, right? Like, I think that stewardship of story in past that she talked about at the end is so important. And I love the way that she gave me a couple of categories that I think I had conflated, and I think it's actually better to have them as distinct categories. When she was talking about the two stories that she was telling, that an Easter vigil gives opportunity to tell, right? Both the sacred story that is the resurrection of Christ on the first Easter morning, but also the church history story of this is a tradition. And there are elements of this that go all the way back. And like Abraham did, blah, blah, blah. And it just, I'm honestly, I'm a little ashamed. I wrote a chapter in my book called about how the church is, quote, an embodied narrative. And you bet your everything that I talked about the way that the church embodies the gospel. So the sacred story. But I didn't realize until just this conversation that I didn't even touch on how the church historical component of that is this connective tissue that anchors our rehearsal of the story into a tradition that stretches back to the sacred story, and is actually the way that we apprehend the beauty and the goodness and the truth of the sacred story is actually by understanding how it's been passed on. And I didn't even touch it. And I'm honestly embarrassed even to realize that. Never mind say it on a recording now. But I just,
you can always write another book, bro.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
We'll read it.
Well, thank you. Now I have one copy pre-sold. Catching up to Dr. Stonebraker. But no, I just that, if I've mentioned before how I talked to our staff about how, like, hey, we got to resist the temptation to try and chase revival. God's not calling us to chase revival. He's calling us to build a remnant. And the how of that had better start and end with remember. And I man, I'm so grateful that she was like, I feel like she helped put that on my radar in a really, not totally new, but a very fresh and invigorating way. I love it.
Well, it just reminds me, even so, taking this lens that we've talked about in this episode and putting it on the Lord's Supper, that we remember his death until he comes.
Yeah.
Right? Like, think about that through the lens of time, right? Here we are, we're taking this sacred thing, this sacrament, we're taking it at this moment in time as a way to say that we embody time, but here is where time is heading. And so we do this to be sustained by the Holy Spirit and by Christ himself in this moment as the clock ticks forward to him returning. We're in a story.
Absolutely. And here's a beautiful stinking example of that. I'm getting excited here. I didn't even know this happened a few weeks ago when I was leading liturgy. The slides were messing up during communion, and the part of the liturgy that says, where we say, therefore we proclaim the mystery of the faith. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again, past, present, future. I didn't know that the slides were messing up because it was behind me and I was going off of my notes, and the congregation didn't skip a beat because they had rehearsed that story every
So they
week.
didn't even have the words up there. They knew it. Wow.
And it's like, well, it's not that many words, Brad. Like, stop making such a big deal about it. But that's an example of how liturgy shapes and forms us. And, we periodically point out how this is past, present, and future tense, that this isn't just a proclamation of one-time information about that's good. The gospel is an ongoing story in which we are situated and participating as we take communion. We are not disinterested observers. We are players in the play. And God invites us in and promises to use us in ways that make zero sense to anyone who's like picking players for their kickball team. But God's economy is different, right?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is great.
Good stuff, man. Another really fun episode. I look forward to the next one with you.
Absolutely. Till next time, as we continue the story. I'm sorry. That hurt.
Yeah, it did.
Right.
It did.
See you
All
later.
right. I'll forgive you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. If you found this episode helpful, text it to a friend. Please take a minute and rate this podcast. Leaving a review helps other people find us and connect. You can send us questions or feedback by emailing us at posteverythingpod@gmail.com. Thank you.